Welcome to episode 0, Closing the Loop. I've been sitting with how to begin this podcast because, frankly, this isn't just a horse podcast or a training diary or an Olympic comeback story, although it's probably a little bit of everything. It's something much more personal than that. This podcast is really about what happens when the dream you once carried refuses to leave you alone, even after life breaks you apart and then rebuilds you into someone entirely different. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Merja Sumilov, and this podcast is my honest documentation of returning to elite eventing and pursuing the Brisbane 2032 Olympics after walking away from that dream it's actually over 15 years ago. But to understand why this matters so deeply to me, I think we need to go a little bit further back than horses, competition, and Olympic ambitions. I'd like to talk a little bit about that little girl in Finland sitting on that brown, amazing Finnish draft horse named Donut. When I was about 5 years old, my uncle lifted me onto this enormous horse. I remember running my fingers through his mane and breathing in that smell. You know, that smell of horses in the summer? It's earthy and warm and almost ancient. And for the first time in my life, I felt safe. And that moment became the foundation of my entire life. Even though, of course, I didn't understand it at the time. I was just 5. But before horses came into my sphere of consciousness, my whole world was really chaotic. There was parental narcissism, alcoholism, instability, obviously, a lot of fear, violence, hypervigilance. You know, the kind of childhood where your nervous system learns very quickly that safety is never guaranteed. But then horses changed that for me a little bit. Horses kind of became the first place or the first beings that reflected something back to me that most humans couldn't, certainly hadn't to that point. And that was congruence, honesty, presence, and safety. And I think that's why horses have always mattered to me on a level that goes far beyond sport. They didn't, care about my image or my performance masks or social status or pretending that everything was fine. They just responded to what was actually happening inside me. And horses have always had this extraordinary ability to reveal truth. They're the ultimate leveler. It doesn't matter how rich or beautiful or intelligent you are, horses will challenge you to be whole. And as I grew older, horses became more than just comfort for me, They became purpose. They became a bit of an identity. When I was 16, I went to an agricultural college to study horse sciences, and ever since then, they certainly became an identity. They became the thing I was willing to work endlessly for until I couldn't. And I'll talk about that another time. But I was so committed to working hard that eventually that path led me toward high performance eventing and toward the dream of the Olympics for 2012 with Vesper. At that stage of my life, I genuinely believed that achievement would heal my childhood. I thought that if I could just, work hard enough or become disciplined enough, or if I was successful enough, if I won enough competitions, I'd be finally good enough, and then something inside of me would feel whole. But of course, life has this way of interrupting the stories that we build around ourselves, because the older you get, the more you realize that the only way to be good enough is to accept all of who you are and make the most of it for you, not for anyone else. Vesper, this horse that I was training for the 2012 Olympics, she was a special horse. And I remember going to do a purchase inspection on her. I was living in Dublin at the time, and Vesper was based in Cork. And I was flying to Cork, and there was all these other airlines were grounded because when we left Dublin, because there was a 147-kilometer-an-hour wind, but not Ryanair. We kept going, and we got to Cork, and the plane nearly crashed on the landing. And I remember in my body that feeling as the aircraft fought the wind, and just the terror moving through the cabin. People were crying and praying, and the instability of that descent and potential crash landing. Everyone was realizing that they were not okay. There was this massive energy in that cabin. And then when the plane finally landed, and good for you, pilot, whoever you were, thank you for keeping us safe. Everybody was so elated and so kind to each other, and so loving and caring and considerate. Needless to say, I took a bus back from Cork. But that was my starting point to go and meet Vesper, and we got on really well. And I purchased her, and she came into my stable block, and yeah, I was very, very blessed to have her. We did some competitions, some events. We got 2 third placings in Dublin Horse Show, and that horse, she was so wise. And we were actually aiming for the, as a part of the Olympic journey back then, we were aiming for the Young Horse World Championships in Les Lions d'Angers, where they are every year. And before we got the qualifications, she got injured, and it was a career-ending injury. And it really, it shattered the Olympic path for her. But if I'm being honest, and some of you might have heard me talk about this before, it shattered more than that sporting dream. It really dismantled my identity. I didn't handle the loss well at all. I walked away carrying the grief I didn't know how to process. The trauma that I had been carrying since I was a child now surfaced, wasn't integrated to deal with it. And my nervous system had spent, was exhausted already, because it had spent decades trying to survive rather than truly live. And so for the longest time, I thought the story about Vesper's injury and how it all turned out was about failure. I had failed. I had failed her. I had failed the dream. I just wasn't good enough, and I didn't deserve anything. But now, looking back with much more maturity and compassion for myself, I can see something entirely different. That even though there was nothing I could do about Vesper's injury, because it happened in the paddock while I wasn't even there, it took me a while to realize that what had happened wasn't actually the problem. It was just preparation. It was a detour I took for 15 years into personal development and personal empowerment. But I didn't realize at the time that it was preparation. So this year, 2026, February 26th, Vesper passed away. And there's something deeply disorienting about losing a horse who carried so much of your identity and history and hope and grief, even if you'd already, inverted commas, dealt with it. It felt like the final closing of a door that had remained emotionally half open for years, because as long as she was alive, I didn't have to face the fact that my Olympic journey was over. But then, within weeks from Vesper passing, Heikki came into my life. And I don't say that lightly, because horses arrive differently and at different stages of our becoming. Some come to wake us up, some come to break us open, and some come to carry our dreams. And when we are finally ready to become the person we were always trying to be, that's when some horses arrive. And Heikki didn't enter my life as a replacement for Vesper, because that's impossible, although the timing was very, very suspicious to me. Because, obviously horses are not interchangeable. Relationships are not interchangeable. If I'm honest, it kind of felt as though life quietly whispered that perhaps the story wasn't over yet. And maybe that's what this podcast really is. Not like a comeback story with glory in the traditional sense and, oh, look at me chasing the Olympics again. No. I don't have any energy for hype or any of that stuff anymore. I'm 48. That's like far too shallow for me. This is about emotional integration. And it's about what happens when you stop trying to dominate yourself into success and instead begin learning how to lead yourself with awareness, honesty, and compassion. And over the last 15 years or so, I keep saying 15 years, it's more than that, but I'm too lazy to count. But in that time, I've immersed myself in understanding what healing actually is. Healing from childhood narcissistic parental wound, what that is. What healing from being a child of an alcoholic looks like. Nervous system regulation, emotional regulation, conscious leadership, self-leadership, and leadership of others. Obviously, horsemanship. Some of you know me from Linda Pirelli's How to Talk Horse curriculum as the only Australian teacher currently. I also took a deep dive into psychology and the deeper layers of what actually creates safety and connection. I became so fascinated by why some riders freeze under pressure and some become controlling when they feel afraid. And also from the horse's perspective, like, why do they get anxious? Why do they shut down? Why do they become explosive or disconnected, depending on the emotional congruence of the human being standing next to them or sitting on top of them? It's crazy how much our energy affects and intertwines with theirs. And then slowly over time, I realized something that I feel is quite profound, but I don't want to make myself sound profound. I'm just doing what I'm doing here. And that's that horsemanship is not separate from self-awareness. Horsemanship is self-awareness, because the horse reflects the relationship we have with ourselves. When I realized that, I was ready to take a piece of my work called The Four People Within that I'd written for a personality hacker years and years and years ago, and turn it into a book for equestrians. And Now I'm so excited to be teaching about the thinker and the feeler and the sensor and the intuitive in every horse lover, every rider, every equestrian, and how those inner parts shape how we ride and lead and communicate and connect with our horses. But this podcast is not going to be me pretending to have the whole of life figured out. That's not like I am on a constant journey to the day I die. This is not that. Far from it. This is going to be a very honest, kind of real time documentation of becoming and closing this Olympic loop that I started with Vesper 20 years ago. This is rebuilding confidence for me, also, if I'm honest. This is about being vulnerable, of navigating fear, learning how to pursue excellence without abandoning myself in the process, especially when things don't go as planned. I'm trying to become the kind of human being that my horse can genuinely trust and wants to be led by. I think that there comes a time in life when all of us quietly realize that we're running out of time because, you know, the older you get, the more stiff your body becomes. And I don't mean that in a very dramatic way, just in an honest way. You one day you might wake up and realize that, you're not living your life. You're not living a life that looks like you, that belongs to you. You might be carrying unfinished dreams and unresolved grief, or maybe there's still a little part of you or a little quiet voice within you that wants you to be brave enough to begin your life, begin again, and this time living a life that looks like you. And of course, beginnings are terrifying, especially if you're older and wiser and more aware of the consequences of, of what life is, and you're no longer protected by youthful naivety. But I also think that there's a different kind of pain that comes from not beginning, not closing that loop, at least not attempting to. I can't imagine arriving at the end of my life and still wonder what would have happened if I'd closed this loop. Do I trust myself enough to try, even if I know that it's much higher likelihood that I'll fail than that I'll succeed? And when I think about closing the loop, I don't just think about returning to eventing or revisiting an Olympic dream specifically. I think about the loops of in all of our lives that quietly remain open until something happens, like for me when Vesper passed away. We have some memories, maybe, of conversations that we never had, that we wish we had had. Maybe some grief we never processed. I don't know about you, but I certainly had lots of parts of me that I abandoned in order to survive, preserve some kind of dignity. The dreams that we convinced ourselves were unrealistic because disappointment hurt way too much. I think that many people are walking around carrying these invisible, unfinished stories within them, like I did for years, for a couple decades. Well, whatever. And at some point, we have to ask ourselves that difficult question. What would we regret on our deathbed? Would we regret trying and failing, or never allowing ourselves to fully go for it? I'm not one for judging. If you know me personally, you know that to be true. But for me personally, the answer was very, very clear. I knew I would regret abandoning the deepest part of myself far more than I would ever regret being vulnerable enough to pursue something meaningful again. And perhaps that is the real courage for me in this season of life. Not pretending that I'm fearless or, that I'm not worrying about things, but choosing what matters despite that fear. Choosing to show up with an open heart after life has already broken it before. Choosing to trust horses, ourselves, and the process of becoming, even though there are no guarantees about how that story ends. So I don't know about you, but when you feel like as a child that you're never good enough, you're always going for the perfection. And thankfully, that's no longer the case for me, because that is an exhausting weight to carry. My goal is integration. And maybe that's what this closing the loop really actually means for me. Not returning to who I was before everything fell apart, but returning to the dream as someone far wiser, safer, softer, clearer, and definitely more whole. So I want this podcast to follow the practical realities of training. It's inspired by my 70-day little video series I did in Instagram and Facebook. And I just simply have no time to do this every day anymore. Now that Heikki has entered my life and I'm back to training. So yeah, practical realities of training horses and preparing for high performance sport. And yes, it will also explore the emotional realities underneath all of it. You know, the identity shifts that happen as you grow, the grief that you live, love, and sometimes let go. What nervous system responses come up when life gets in the way. Because there's going to be moments of doubt and moments where my horses will humble me. They always do. The moments where maybe they can help me heal a little bit more. And the quiet victories that nobody sees and I'm unlikely to report on. So this holds me accountable for reporting victories too. I really want this space to feel like a conversation that you can also exhale into. A bit of a place where horse women and men and people, not everyone's welcome, but especially women rebuilding themselves later in life, where we can feel seen. It's not ridiculous to have big dreams, even if you were born in the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, whatever. Because I am not the only person carrying an unfinished dream. I know that for a fact. And I also know that I'm not the only person trying to reconcile ambition with emotional well-being. So wherever you're listening from, whether you're chasing a competitive goal or even if you're rebuilding confidence after an accident or any kind of fear, or you've lost a little bit of the confidence when you've had, family and or changed careers or something's happened. If you're navigating burnout, if you're healing through horses or whatever, if you're simply trying to remember who you are beneath survival mode, welcome. I'm honored that you're here. And maybe together we can discover that sometimes the dream never died. Maybe the person pursuing it simply needed to become whole enough to carry it. I'll see you at the next one.